All right, everybody, welcome back. Here we are, ready to get started on chapter 31. What the book calls From the Age of Limits to the Age of Reagan, but let's face it, all that really matters is that it's the age of Reagan. We're not going to get into the presidency of Ronald Reagan much today, but we are going to talk about the two presidents that preceded him, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, and the challenges that they face. So, before we get into that, let's set the stage. Last chapter we kind of finished off talking about Watergate and what happened with that, and the general crisis state that America is in the early 1970s. With the stagflation crisis, inflation rates going up significantly. In the mid 1970s, they would get as high as they would get up above 10%, like 11, 12, even more. And interest rates would grow. There's all kinds of economic problems in the 1970s. You've got the energy crisis still going on, which is creating a lot of these economic issues, and the general disdain now that people have for the government in wake of the failure of Vietnam and what's happened with Watergate. So there's all these problems in America during this time that make it really difficult, honestly, for any president to be able to handle, and that would bear itself out in the administrations of both Carter and Gerald Ford. So let's go ahead and get into this one. I'm going to say it again. Hopefully this one will be a little bit shorter, but we'll see what happens. By the end of this week, you'll have all the notes for the rest of the year, so that's good, at least for videos here, and let's go ahead and jump right to it. All right. So the presidency of Gerald Ford is a difficult one. He's in a really tough position, right? He's the guy that comes in after the guy that everybody says is a terrible person, right? So Richard Nixon has effectively, I don't want to say ruined the presidency, but certainly created a sense of mistrust in the presidency. And you have to understand, this is a first for most of the living Americans, and certainly voting Americans, right? You could have said that about maybe Warren Harding or even Herbert Hoover, but all the presidents since then, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, even Lyndon Johnson for the most part, and Nixon early in his presidency, had really built up the presidency and were people that were generally trusted by Americans. And now suddenly you've got that trust broken because of Watergate and what Richard Nixon did. So Gerald Ford is in a very difficult position. Okay, his presidency in many ways isn't even really necessarily referred to as a presidency. Some people call it a custodianship. Basically, somebody that's hanging on to it because he's the next person in line, so it's got to be him. Ironically, Gerald Ford is the only president in our country's history to not be elected in any way to that position because he wasn't elected vice president. Richard Nixon's vice president was Spiro Agnew, who had gotten in trouble, not after, but around the same time as Watergate because he accepted bribes while he was the governor of Maryland. So he resigned the vice presidency. Gerald Ford becomes vice president, and then all the Watergate stuff happens, and Gerald Ford, a man who is not Nixon's running mate, who was not elected to the vice presidency and was not elected to the presidency, now finds himself as president. He was the high-ranking member of the Republican Party in the House, and therefore was made vice president, and now ultimately becomes president of the United States. Okay, and he's got, again, a difficult job. He's a guy nobody picked. He's a Republican who, at this point, because of Nixon, people are very skeptical of the government in general, but in particular Republicans. And early in his presidency, he goes out and pardons Richard Nixon for any crimes associated with Watergate. Now, a lot of people were upset about this in the 1970s. Nixon should face, the crimes just like any normal person would. But in my opinion, and this is my opinion, uh, Gerald Ford did the right thing here. He famously said the day after Nixon resigned and he gave an address to the nation, he gave the famous line where he said, to the American people, that our long national nightmare is over, referring obviously to Watergate. And then about a month or so later, he kind of pardons Nixon of all crimes. And he does this to say, with his belief, which he did believe, I genuinely believe that Gerald Ford, because he was a good man, believed this, that, if there would have been a huge trial of Richard Nixon and everything, it would have just kept all this Watergate stuff and everything fresh in the minds of the American people. And that would have been damaging further to the American psyche. And what Gerald Ford really wants to do in his presidency is restore people's confidence in the government, restore people's confidence in the United States of America, which has been damaged because of Vietnam, because of Watergate. So a lot of people said, oh, that Ford must have had a backroom deal or something with Nixon to pardon him of crimes. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But I think his action in pardoning Nixon, given the circumstances, it was the right thing to do. One thing that doesn't help the presidency of Ford is, what I had mentioned before on the last slide, persistent economic problems. We still have stagflation going on, not quite as bad as it was under Nixon, but, that's a bad thing. So interest rates continue to climb. They get as high as like 20%, and they go higher than that. For context, the federal government determines the interest rate. In other words, if I wanted to buy a home and I'd have a mortgage payment, basically whatever the national interest rate is would determine the amount of interest I pay on that. And the interest gets as high as 20. When an interest rate is 20%, you're basically paying, for $100, you're paying $120 if it's a loan, depending on, how long you have it or whatever. That's really high. By comparison, the interest rate right now is like record low levels, in part because of the pandemic, and has hovered between 0.5 and 2% really over about the last year and a half to 2 years. So we have extremely low interest rates now. So compare that with in the mid 70s when you're talking a 20% interest rate, you can understand where we have a lot of economic problems. And Ford never seems to kind of beat back these challenges and problems that he has. He's got, he's kind of more of a moderate Republican. And we're starting to see, like we mentioned a few videos ago when I was talking about the women's movement, that woman Phyllis Schlafly, who was against, the Equal Rights Amendment and all that stuff. We're starting to see a real pushback in America, and I'll talk about that more on the next slide, against these kind of what are viewed as more liberal policies. The American public in general is starting to say enough is enough with that. We saw it start a little bit under Nixon, and we're seeing it more now. And Ford, being kind of a more moderate Republican, just isn't really the guy that represents the party at this particular time. So in 1976, Ford wins a very close primary election. As like I said before, it's very rare that an incumbent president loses the primary. He wins a very close primary election against a California guy by the name of Ronald Wilson Reagan. So that's one mistake America made in not picking Reagan in 1976, but that's okay. And then goes up in the election in 1976 against Jimmy Carter. He's not going to win, as this map shows us. Ford is in a tough position, right? It's like the guy before him kind of wrecked everything, and he's got to come in and fix it. Like, say you got a mechanic working on a car, and this guy like totally destroys and ruins all the engine and all the stuff in the car. Then they call this other guy to fix it, because they get rid of the one guy, and the guy does the best he can to fix it, but it's just not right yet. So then the guy comes to pick up his car and he says, what the heck's the problem? Who are they going to blame? Well, they're going to blame the mechanic that actually tried to fix things, but it wasn't perfectly fixed. That's Gerald Ford. And that allows Jimmy Carter to win the presidency in 1976 in a very unique election. Obviously, the states that always go Republican, these around here, they still go Republican. But states that generally go Republican, particularly in the South around here, they go for Jimmy Carter. Why? Because Jimmy Carter's from Georgia, and he's something different. He seems kind of a political outsider. He seems like somebody who is going to be different. And after Nixon and, Lyndon Johnson and the way things had been for a while, people kind of want an outsider. And Carter represents that to people. In large part by carrying the South down here, the southern states down here that, often go for Republicans, we see, Carter kind of, obviously win the presidency. The best part about the election in this year was one electoral vote went to a third candidate who wasn't even on the ballot. This is what's awesome. Ronald Reagan, because he doesn't win the Republican nomination in 1976, doesn't even get a single vote for president in terms of the popular vote, but yet he gets an electoral vote because some person, probably a very intelligent person in the state of Washington, said, I'm not going to give Gerald Ford the vote. I'm going to give it to Ronald Wilson Reagan. So let's talk a little bit about Carter's presidency. Okay, this is a very interesting one. Carter, in a lot of ways, is like Ford. He's inheriting a very bad situation, and it's a situation that isn't going to get better during his presidency. Okay, Jimmy Carter is genuinely mocked as a president because he had very few successes. I even touch on that in the annotated notes I gave you and in the packet for chapter 31 if you read it closely. But somewhat that's an unfair characterization. Jimmy Carter's a good man, is genuinely a good man, who came into the presidency at a very rough time. And his biggest problem was the fact that as president, he wanted to seemingly fix every problem of the world. And it's better maybe to focus on a few things, a couple things, and do those well. Do few things well rather than do everything mediocre to bad. Unfortunately for Carter, he ends up doing everything mediocre to bad. As I mentioned before, the inflation rates continue to grow under Carter. They get bad. Stagflation is still happening. Unemployment is going up. Hopefully we understand that whole stagflation concept. When inflation goes up, generally people are supposed to make more money to keep up with the inflation rate. Theoretically, in jobs, when people get a raise every year, essentially that raise is really meant to stay pace with whatever the inflation situation is at a particular time, because things cost more over time. So Carter's got to deal with soaring inflation. Meanwhile, at the same time, and I want you to take a close look at this graph. This represents between 1979 and 2007 how jobs have kind of changed. The job base in America has kind of changed. Okay. Now notice in 1979 and kind of the first graphs here versus 2007, which are the second ones. And what changes do we see? Is one, that for the most part, for most American people, this graph represents how much wage growth has kind of been stagnant over time. Okay, so when we're talking about different income groups, like right here, we've got the richest people. Then we've got middle class, lower class, poor. Right. So in percentage of income that they get. Right. So here we see those numbers actually go down or become stagnant. while the richest people in America make significantly more money. Um, what is one of the main factors for this? Of course, another thing that we see that causes kind of all this to happen is that beginning in the late 1970s is when we really begin to see the significant decline in manufacturing jobs, right? As we focus less and less on industrialization, which of course built America in the late 19th, early 20th to the mid 20th century, and more people are getting jobs that represents kind of this higher portion of income, whereas everybody else kind of has a very stagnant amount of money that they make and very little opportunity to climb up the ladder, so to speak. So I just want to throw that out there. Interesting. I'll just say this. Interesting that I'm very specifically going over this particular graph. That's all I'm going to say about that. All right. Making matters worse for Jimmy Carter. As I said before, Jimmy Carter tries to solve every problem on his own, and he has a lot of problems. Okay, the worst year of his presidency, without question, is 1979. In 1979, America's number one enemy of the 1980s ultimately would be the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran. And on November 4th, 1979, the people of Iran, encouraged by Khomeini, break into our embassy in Tehran, or Iran, and take 53 Americans hostages, where they would be hostages for the next 444 days, all the way up until the day Ronald Reagan gets inaugurated president. This was in response to ultimately containment policy, with which the United States had been very involved in Iran for ever since the 1950s, and basically the Iranians were tired of it and didn't want us there anymore, so they decided to do this hostage thing, and that has very damaging effects on the United States. Most importantly, like the Vietnam War before it, it is a big drop in kind of United States power and prestige. Power and prestige around the world, right? All of a sudden now we don't look to be, the great superpower that people rely on us to be. And of course, with Jimmy Carter as president, with that happening, not going to be very well. Not going to go very well for him. If you've ever seen the movie Argo, the movie Argo is largely centered around what happened with the Iranian hostages. Making matters worse is shortly after this happens, Afghanistan is invaded by the Soviet Union. And Carter basically says what's tantamount to this could cause World War III and is basically the worst thing that's ever happened, which is a bit of an overstatement. But it's Carter's response that is really, really bad. So as we know, because of containment, the Cold War is still something that's very important to the American people. And we gain, I guess, what you'd call a great victory. What you get is a great victory in the Cold War when, in the Olympics, when the United States wins the Miracle on Ice and defeats the Soviet Union. Well, Carter follows that up by saying, you know what, the 1980 Summer Olympics are in Moscow, and because you guys invaded Afghanistan, which again, most Americans probably don't care about anyway, we're not going to send a team. This politicizes the Olympic Games, makes a lot of American people very, very angry, and basically destroys any slim chance that Jimmy Carter has of getting reelected in 1980. Okay, what causes Carter's failure? Okay, it's these reactions to these international events. It's the continued economic problems. It's also the 3 Mile Island disaster that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about, but basically had a nuclear meltdown at a plant in Pennsylvania, and then that made everybody worried about energy. So all kinds of problems, and in 1980 makes things very tough for Carter. At the same time, we're kind of seeing a major shift in the political ideals of many Americans. Okay, and this is what people tend to call the New American Right. Um, it's still around today. It's basically the conservative ideology of today is kind of part of that New American Right set of beliefs. Um, Essentially, what these people believe, these people believe, is that all the liberal policies and things that our country has gone through, over the past couple decades, have eroded the moral character of the country. People have stepped away from their faith and God and all these other things, and we need to go back to that. We need to address a family values-based culture. People are genuinely afraid that the culture and society of America has been significantly eroded by all these liberal efforts, Great Society, Civil Rights Movement, all these other things. And this helps, certainly catapult Ronald Reagan, thank God, to the presidency in 1980, because he represents, a lot of these beliefs that people on the so-called New American Right want to believe. What leads to this belief is kind of the redistribution of population in the country, particularly in what are called the Sun Belt states, which really goes across the whole American South. If you look at three of the main Sun Belt states, California, Texas, and Florida, they've grown significantly in population, from since the 1950s, and they are taking away from the population of the northern industrial cities, and they're adapting to the cultures and beliefs of the regions that they're living in. Now, California, of course, is super liberal now, but it wasn't as much in 1980, especially when the Republican candidate for president is a Californian, so they're going to vote for him. But anyway, they go back to kind of these old ideologies of rugged individualism and these things that Americans hold dear, that tend to be more in line with the beliefs of the South. The cowboys in the West, these individual guys that go out and make their own way and stuff of that nature. So that's kind of part of the ideological process of these folks. And of course, it's still that way today, with the exception of California. What else aids that is this massive growth in evangelicalism, which of course is a big deal today too. These people are encouraged, by what they consider moral failures of, Roe v. Wade and allowing and legalization of abortion. And what they, kind of relate that to is this idea that American people have lost faith and there's no place for God in American society and all this stuff. So we see this massive growth in religion. Probably, and the book says this, probably the biggest religious movement in this country since the Second Great Awakening, where people suddenly, go back to faith. We have the whole idea of the born-again Christians coming around that feel this closeness in their faith and feel represented, by the ideologies of the right. They think government has overstepped. They think government is going too far in controlling people's lives. In other words, regulation. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit more about regulation and deregulation when we talk about Reagan. But they're tired of the government kind of overstepping and putting so many regulations on people's lives, right? So this is a counterpoint or a counter movement to the movement that had happened, that we'd seen a lot in the early 70s and the 60s. All the civil rights stuff, all the Great Society stuff. We're taking care of all the people that seem to be unable to take care of themselves. But, this New American Right and all these people are saying, well, we work hard and we do what we're supposed to do. Where's our reward for that? We just have to pay the taxes and get screwed over by, everybody else. So, and that's a big part of it. One of the big movements that's part of this is something called the Sagebrush Rebellion. When we talk about government regulation, one of the things they did was protect a lot of lands, particularly in the South and West. And a lot of that land was like barren desert type land. And the Sagebrush Rebellion, which the book doesn't explain particularly well, is just a movement by people in these areas like Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Kansas, states that have a lot of dry, arid desert area to say, why does the government need to protect these lands? They should be open for economic development, which is going to put money in people's pockets and is going to create jobs in these regions. So they're big supporters and big pushers for, big pushers for deregulation, which is something that, again, I'll get into next slide. Just take a quick look, right? Growth of the Sun Belt from 1970 to 1990. So, the biggest cities in America had always been up here, but by the 1990 and starting in the 70s, you're seeing all these cities that and regions that are growing tremendously in population, right? While these areas have very small growth up here, have very small growth in population, you're seeing 50% or more population growth in places like Florida and Texas, right around that number in places like California, well, really the West in general, parts of the East. So we're seeing people move out of kind of these industrial northern cities and into other regions of the country. And you see that, here, like it represents the where these cities stood in 1970 in national population versus 1990, right? By 19, look at how many of them: San Diego, Phoenix, San Antonio, Houston, Dallas. In 1970, weren't even on the list of top 10 most populous cities in the United States, and here by 1990, they're all in the top 10 list. Houston's all the way at 4. So huge changes in the country, and we'll continue talking about that next time when we talk about the presidency of one Ronald Wilson Reagan. Amen. See you then.